I didn't know the most dangerous Korean mafia boss in Seoul would fall for a woman who dared to slap him across the face. Most people don't live to tell that story, but Maya isn't most people. Before we start, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of this addictive saga. The high-end gala in Seoul was silent, filled only with the sound of expensive jewelry clinking and soft piano music. Maya stood out in her deep emerald dress, her natural curls styled perfectly, looking like royalty even though she was just there to translate. Suddenly, a heavy hand gripped her waist with a sense of ownership that made her skin crawl. It was Kenji, the man everyone whispered about in fear, the leader of the city's most dangerous organization. Without thinking, Maya spun around and her palm connected with his face in a loud, sharp slap that echoed through the ballroom. The silence that followed was terrifying as every bodyguard in the room reached for their jacket. Kenji didn't move. He just touched his reddening cheek and looked at Maya with eyes like cold glass. He was used to people trembling at his feet, not defying him in front of his enemies. Maya didn't back down or apologize, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked him right in the eye, told him never to touch her again, and walked out into the cold night air. Kenji watched her leave, a strange and dangerous spark igniting in his chest for the first time in years. He didn't order his men to hurt her. Instead, he ordered them to find out every single detail about her life. By the next morning, Maya found her small apartment filled with thousands of white roses, a silent message that he was now watching her. She threw them all in the trash, but she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back. She went to work at the university, trying to pretend her life hadn't just changed forever. The pressure began slowly as Maya's bank accounts were frozen and her landlord suddenly asked her to move out. She knew it was him, trying to squeeze her until she had nowhere else to run. Every time she turned a corner, a black sleek car was idling nearby, waiting for her to brake. She tried to go to the police, but the officers just looked at the floor when she mentioned Kenji's name. She was completely alone in a foreign country, facing a man who bought and sold cities for breakfast. One night, as Maya walked home through a dark alley, 3 men who weren't Kenji's staff cornered her. They were rivals looking to get back at Kenji by hurting the woman who had publicly embarrassed him. Maya fought back with everything she had, but she was outnumbered and terrified. Just as the lead attacker grabbed her, a shadow moved faster than the human eye could follow. Kenji appeared like a ghost, his face a mask of pure fury as he took down the men with brutal, efficient strikes. After the fight, Kenji stood in the rain, not because it was poetic, but because the sky had simply turned gray and heavy. He offered Maya his hand, his expensive suit ruined, and his knuckles bleeding from protecting her. Maya looked at his hand, then at his face, seeing a flicker of something human behind the monster's mask. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't run away this time either. She realized that the slap hadn't made him hate her, it had made him obsessed with her. Kenji leaned in close, his voice a low growl that made the air feel thick with tension. He told her that she was now the most hunted woman in Korea because of that slap, and only he could keep her alive. He promised she wouldn't have to sleep in a cold apartment anymore, but Maya knew the price would be her freedom. She looked him in the eye and told him she'd rather sleep on the street than be a bird in his cage. Kenji smiled for the first time, a dark, hungry look that promised he would never stop trying to win. Maya woke up the next morning not in her apartment, but in a bedroom larger than her entire childhood home. The walls were made of glass, overlooking the Seoul skyline, and the bedsheets felt like they cost more than her college tuition. She tried the door, but it was locked, though a tray of her favorite breakfast, things he shouldn't have known she liked, was waiting. Kenji entered an hour later, looking perfectly calm in a gray suit, acting as if he hadn't kidnapped her. He told her she was a guest for her own safety, but Maya knew this was just a high-tech prison. She spent the first 3 days refusing to eat, trying to show him that he couldn't control her spirit. Kenji didn't yell or get angry. He simply sat at the table with her every night, eating in silence. He watched the way she held herself with pride even when she was exhausted and scared. He started leaving books by her favorite authors on the nightstand, showing her he was paying attention to her mind, not just her face. Maya hated that he was being kind because it was harder to fight a gentleman than a monster. One evening, Kenji took her to the roof of the mansion and showed her the lights of the city below. He told her about his childhood, about how he had to become a monster to survive the streets she now walked. It was the first time Maya saw the scars on his soul, and for a moment, her anger softened into pity. But then he touched her hair, and she pulled away, reminding him that a beautiful prison is still a prison. He looked hurt for a split second before his face turned back into stone. To test her, Kenji left the door to her room unlocked one night and told the guards to let her walk. Maya made it all the way to the front gate before she saw the dozens of men waiting in the shadows of the street. She realized Kenji was right about one thing: his enemies were everywhere, and they were much worse than him. She walked back into the house on her own, and Kenji was waiting in the hallway with a glass of water. He didn't say, "I told you so," but his eyes said everything. The tension between them grew until it felt like a wire stretched to the breaking point. Kenji began taking Maya to business meetings, forcing her to sit by his side as his queen to show his power. Maya used these moments to study him, realizing he wasn't just a criminal, but a man carrying the weight of 1,000 lives. She saw him show mercy to a worker's family, and it confused everything she thought she knew about him. She started to wonder if the man who grabbed her waist was different from the man standing before her now. One night, Kenji came to her room, but he wasn't looking for a fight or a win. He looked broken. His closest friend had betrayed him, and for the first time, the powerful boss looked like a lonely boy. He didn't try to get in her bed. He just sat on the floor at the foot of it and asked her to talk to him. Maya sat on the edge of the mattress and told him stories of her home, of a life where people loved without wanting anything in return. He fell asleep right there on the floor, guarding her door from the inside. By the end of the second hour, the dynamic had shifted completely from captor and prisoner to something much more dangerous. Maya realized she was starting to look for Kenji in the hallways, and Kenji was starting to change his rules for her. He stopped ordering her and started asking, but the danger outside was growing. A rival gang sent a message, a literal explosion at the gate, proving that Maya was the only way to get to Kenji. He looked at Maya and realized that by trying to keep her, he had put a target on her heart. The explosion changed everything, turning the mansion from a palace into a fortress. Kenji refused to let Maya out of his sight, even moving his office into the room next to hers. He was working 20 hours a day to find out who had attacked them, his face growing thin and his eyes dark with lack of sleep. Maya found herself making him tea and forcing him to eat, surprised by her own urge to care for the man who had stolen her freedom. The anger was still there, but it was being buried under a mountain of shared trauma. One afternoon, Maya found a hidden room in the basement filled with files on her family back in America. She realized Kenji hadn't just been watching her. He had been sending money to her sick mother and protecting her brother from debt collectors. She confronted him, screaming that he couldn't buy her love by manipulating her family. Kenji stood there and took her rage, eventually admitting that he did it because he didn't know any other way to be good. He told her he didn't want to buy her, he wanted to deserve her. The rival gang, led by a man who was Kenji's own cousin, managed to infiltrate the house through a bribed guard. Maya was in the kitchen when the power went out and the screaming started in the hallways. She hid in a pantry, her heart thumping against her ribs, listening to the sound of gunfire and breaking glass. She realized in that moment that if Kenji died, she would be lost in a world that didn't care if she lived or died. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for him. Kenji found her in the pantry, his shirt soaked in blood, but he wasn't the one who was hurt. He grabbed her hand, not with force, but with a desperate need for connection, and led her to a secret tunnel. He told her he had a plane waiting to take her back to America, where she would be safe and free forever. He was giving her exactly what she had asked for since the night of the slap. Maya looked at the exit, then at the man who was willing to let her go to save her life. She realized then that Kenji's obsession had turned into real, selfless love, which was the most dangerous thing of all. She refused to leave, telling him that she wouldn't run away while he stayed behind to die. Kenji tried to argue, but Maya stood her ground, using the same fire she had the night she slapped him. They spent the night hiding in a safe house in the city, huddled together for warmth on a cold concrete floor. For the first time, they weren't boss and prisoner. They were just two people trying to survive. As the sun rose, Kenji made a phone call that ended the war, sacrificing half of his territory to ensure Maya's safety. He gave up the power he had spent his whole life building just to make sure no one would ever hunt her again. When they returned to the mansion, it was empty of guards and weapons. Kenji told Maya the doors were open and she could leave whenever she wanted, with no strings attached. He walked to his room and shut the door, leaving her alone in the giant hallway. Maya stood at the open front door, looking out at the city where she had first been grabbed. She thought about the slap, the roses, the glass prison, and the man who had just given up everything for her. She realized that the bed he wanted her in wasn't about power anymore. It was about not being alone. She didn't walk out the door. Instead, she walked down the hall and knocked on his door. When he opened it, she didn't slap him. She took his hand and led him back to the center of the house. The explosion at the gate changed everything, turning the mansion from a palace into a fortress. Kenji refused to let Maya out of his sight, moving his entire office into the room next to hers. He worked 20 hours a day to find the attackers, his face growing thin and his eyes dark with exhaustion. Maya found herself making him tea and forcing him to eat, surprised by her own urge to care for her captor. The anger she felt was still there, but it was being buried under a mountain of shared trauma. One afternoon, Maya found a hidden room in the basement filled with files on her family back in America. She realized Kenji hadn't just been watching her. He had been secretly paying her mother's medical bills and protecting her brother from debt collectors. She confronted him, screaming that he couldn't buy her love by manipulating her family. Kenji stood there and took her rage, eventually admitting he did it because he didn't know any other way to be good. He told her he didn't want to buy her, he wanted to deserve her. The rival gang, led by Kenji's own cousin, managed to infiltrate the house through a bribed guard. Maya was in the kitchen when the power went out and the screaming started in the hallways. She hid in a pantry, her heart thumping, listening to the sound of gunfire and breaking glass. She realized in that moment that if Kenji died, she would be lost in a world that didn't care if she lived or died. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for him. Kenji found her in the pantry, his shirt soaked in blood, but he wasn't the one who was hurt. He grabbed her hand, not with force, but with a desperate need, and led her to a secret tunnel. He told her he had a plane waiting to take her back to America, where she would be safe and free forever. He was giving her exactly what she had asked for since the night of the slap. Maya looked at the exit, then at the man who was willing to let her go to save her. She realized then that Kenji's obsession had turned into real, selfless love, which was the most dangerous thing of all. She refused to leave, telling him that she wouldn't run away while he stayed behind to die. Kenji tried to argue, but Maya stood her ground, using the same fire she had the night she slapped him. They spent the night hiding in a safe house, huddled together for warmth on a cold floor. For the first time, they weren't boss and prisoner, they were just two people. As the sun rose, Kenji made a phone call that ended the war, sacrificing half of his territory to ensure Maya's safety. He gave up the power he had spent his whole life building just to make sure no one would ever hunt her again. When they returned to the mansion, it was empty of guards. Kenji told Maya the doors were open and she could leave whenever she wanted, no strings attached. He walked to his room and shut the door, leaving her alone in the giant hallway. Maya stood at the open front door, looking out at the city. She thought about the slap, the roses, the glass prison, and the man who had just given up everything for her. She realized that the bed he wanted her in wasn't about power anymore. It was about not being alone. She didn't walk out the door. Instead, she walked down the hall and knocked on his door. When he opened it, she didn't slap him. She took his hand and stepped inside. Life in the mansion became a quiet routine, but the peace was a lie. Kenji had given up his territory, but his remaining men were unhappy and restless. They saw Maya as a weakness, a foreign distraction that had cost them their power and wealth. One night, Maya overheard Kenji's top general arguing that she needed to disappear for the good of the organization. Kenji's response was a cold threat that left no room for debate. If Maya was touched, the entire city would burn. Maya decided she needed to stop being a victim and started learning the business. She sat in on meetings, her presence making the hardened criminals uncomfortable but silent. She realized Kenji's empire wasn't just about crime. It was about a massive web of debt and favors. She used her background in finance to show him how to move his money into legal businesses. She wanted to give him a way out of the darkness so they could have a future that didn't involve bodyguards. Just as they were finding a rhythm, a woman from Kenji's past appeared at the gates. She was the daughter of a rival boss Kenji was supposed to marry years ago to seal a peace treaty. She claimed that the treaty was still valid and that Kenji's men would only follow him if he fulfilled his promise. This woman looked at Maya with pure hatred, seeing her as an obstacle to a throne. Maya felt a new kind of pain, not fear for her life, but fear of losing Kenji's heart. Kenji refused the marriage immediately, but the pressure from his elders grew to a breaking point. They cut off his remaining funds and stopped protecting his shipments, trying to starve him into submission. Maya watched the man she loved begin to crumble under the weight of choosing between his legacy and his heart. She saw him standing on the balcony late at night, looking at the city he used to rule. She realized that by staying, she might be destroying the very thing that made him feel alive. To save him, Maya secretly met with the rival woman and offered to leave Korea if Kenji's status was restored. The woman laughed and told Maya that Kenji would never let her go unless he believed she had betrayed him. Maya went back to the mansion with a heavy heart, knowing what she had to do. She began acting cold, pushing Kenji away and pretending she was only interested in his money. She saw the light in his eyes start to flicker out, and it hurt worse than any slap. The tension reached a peak when Kenji found a fake bag of money Maya had planted, making it look like she was stealing from him to run away. He cornered her in the library, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. He asked her if everything they had shared was a lie, if she was just another person trying to use him. Maya lied to his face, telling him she never loved him and only stayed for the safety. Kenji didn't yell. He just looked at her like he was seeing a ghost. He ordered her to leave the house immediately, giving her a suitcase and a one-way ticket to New York. As Maya walked toward the car, she didn't look back, even though every bone in her body wanted to scream the truth. She got to the airport and sat at the gate, waiting for her flight, tears finally falling. Just as she was about to board, she saw Kenji's general standing in the distance, a look of realization on his face. He had seen the rival woman's car at the secret meeting and knew Maya was sacrificing herself. The general didn't stop Maya. He let her board the plane, thinking it was better for Kenji to be a king without a heart. But back at the mansion, Kenji had become a monster again, more violent and ruthless than he had ever been. He regained his territory in 3 days, fueled by a dark rage that terrified even his loyalists. He agreed to marry the rival's daughter, but he made it clear he would never look at her or touch her. The wedding was set for the following week, a cold business transaction. In New York, Maya tried to rebuild her life, but the city felt empty and gray. She worked a boring office job and lived in a small apartment, but her mind was always in Seoul. One evening, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a single white rose and a USB drive. The drive contained security footage of the night she betrayed Kenji. It showed his general watching her from the shadows and later confessing the truth to Kenji on his deathbed after a hit gone wrong. The footage showed Kenji's reaction to the truth. He hadn't been angry. He had been devastated. He realized that Maya hadn't cheated him. She had tried to save him by breaking his heart. The video ended with Kenji looking directly into a camera, his face bruised and tired. He told the camera that he was being forced into the marriage to save his men's lives, but he would never belong to anyone but her. Maya realized that the wedding was happening the very next day. She didn't pack a bag. She just took her passport and ran to the airport, buying the last ticket to Seoul with her life savings. She arrived as the city was buzzing about the wedding of the century. The church was surrounded by hundreds of armed men, making it impossible for an outsider to get in. Maya didn't have a weapon or a plan, just the truth. She found a side entrance used by the catering staff and managed to slip inside, disguised in a uniform. She made it to the back of the church just as the ceremony was starting. Kenji stood at the altar, looking like a dead man walking, his eyes fixed on nothing. The rival's daughter stood next to him, smiling like she had won a war. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the room stayed silent, as everyone was too afraid of the guns at the door. Maya stepped out from the shadows into the center aisle and shouted Kenji's name, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The guards leveled their guns at her, but Kenji leaped from the altar, shielding her with his own body. He roared at his men to stand down, his voice shaking the walls. The rival boss stood up, claiming this was an insult that would mean war and the death of everyone in the room. Kenji didn't care. He held Maya's face in his hands, making sure she was real. He told the room full of killers that he would rather die as a man who loved her than live as a king who lost her. The rival boss gave the order to fire, but Kenji's own men didn't move. They had seen Maya's sacrifice and Kenji's loyalty, and for the first time, they chose a leader over a paycheck. They turned their guns on the rivals, forcing them to back down without a single shot being fired. Kenji took Maya's hand and walked her out of the church, leaving the crown and the mafia life behind. He stripped off his expensive jacket and threw it on the ground, a free man at last. Kenji and Maya didn't stay in the city. They fled to a small coastal village where nobody knew his name or his face. They lived in a simple wooden house by the sea, a far cry from the glass mansion in Seoul. Kenji worked as a fisherman, his hands becoming rough and calloused, but his eyes were finally bright and clear. Maya taught English at the local school, finally living the peaceful life she had always wanted. For 6 months, they were just a normal couple, happy and safe. However, the past has a long reach, and Kenji knew his enemies wouldn't let him stay retired forever. He spent his nights sitting on the porch, watching the road, never truly letting his guard down. Maya tried to tell him the war was over, but she saw the way he checked the locks every night. She realized that even though they had escaped the city, the mafia boss was still a part of him. One evening, a black car they didn't recognize pulled into their driveway. Kenji pushed Maya behind him, his hand reaching for a hidden knife he kept under the porch table. A man stepped out of the car, but it wasn't an assassin. It was a young boy, no older than 12. The boy handed Kenji a letter and a small wooden box before running back to the car and speeding away. Kenji opened the letter and his face went pale, his hands shaking for the first time in Maya's memory. It was a message from his father, the man he thought had died 20 years ago. The letter revealed that Kenji's father hadn't died. He had been in hiding, waiting for Kenji to leave the crime life, so he could pass on a secret. The box contained an old key and a map to a location in the mountains of Korea. Maya wanted to ignore it, to keep their quiet life, but she knew Kenji would never be at peace until he knew the truth. They decided to take one last trip together to find the answers, promising this would be the final chapter of their dangerous story. They traveled deep into the mountains to a hidden temple where an old man was waiting for them. It was Kenji's father, alive but frail, living as a monk. He told Kenji that their family wasn't originally a crime family, but protectors of a great historical treasure that had been stolen by the government. The mafia was just a cover they had used for generations to try and get it back. He told Kenji that the war was never about power, but about justice for their ancestors. The twist was that the treasure wasn't gold or jewels. It was a set of documents that proved the current government leaders were corrupt. This was the reason everyone had been trying to kill Kenji, not because he was a criminal, but because he was the only one who could expose them. Kenji looked at the documents, then at Maya. He realized he could use this to truly change the country, to make it a place where someone like Maya would never be harassed or hunted again. In the final scene, Kenji and Maya are back in Seoul, but not as fugitives. They are standing on the steps of the courthouse, having turned over the documents to the highest authorities. The corrupt leaders are being led away in handcuffs, and the city is celebrating a new era. Kenji turns